皆さん、こんにちは。今日のトピックは、特許です。Um, this seminar is from December 2025, and we're uploading it in August of 2026. But this has been the law for a long time, well over 10 years, probably more like 15 plus years. But people still get it wrong all the time. This is rebutting a particular genus species obviousness rejection. It's a very niche topic in biological and chemical cases. It's even more rare in electrical and mechanical cases, but it is important and there's no good name for it. And let's get into it. So these are the topics we'll discuss today. I there's Again, there's no real way to explain what this is about other than to show you. So we'll do some example rejections first. And I guess before we start, I need to make the point that the technical side of the chemical stuff is not quite right because I don't know enough of the chemistry to make sure this is 100% accurate. Office actions sometimes include a rejection, like Shimon describes all of the features of Claim 1, except that the mixture includes isopropyl alcohol. Kamina is introduced as describing alcohols in a mixture. Based on Kamina, it would have been obvious to include within the Shimon mixture isopropyl alcohol. The combination of Kamina with Shimon would achieve the predictable result of reducing infectious agents in the mixture. Demo Kamina does not teach isopropyl alcohol. Okay. Some examiners love making this type of rejection because it is very effective for them to achieve their goals, like issuing office actions, obtaining counts. And so when I was doing this one live, I'd ask people like how many people would argue that Kamina does not teach isopropyl alcohol and then show an advantageous effect of isopropyl alcohol. And of course, that was pretty common. How many people might produce experimental results here? Not so many, but some. And how many would amend the claim? And that's also would receive some votes as well. But we're not going to do that. So let's see what happens with some typical arguments. Okay. You can't really argue that Kamina does not teach isopropyl alcohol, right? Like if you do this in an interview, here's what your examiner is going to say. And I'm telling you, this is exactly what they'll say. This is like the script. The office action is not based on anticipation by Kamina. The rejection is based on obviousness, where the office action relied on Kamina as describing alcohols in a mixture. The obviousness rationale is achieving a predictable result. Isopropyl alcohol is known to be an alcohol in a mixture, right? It is predictable that isopropyl alcohol can reduce infectious agents, right? I mean, it makes so much sense. And then your attorney comes back from the interview and they say it didn't go anywhere. And then, you're back to the beginning again of how do we amend the claim? How do we give the examiner what he wants? But before we go too far, let's consider another example. This is example rejection two. It's all identical except for the yellow highlighted portion, which acknowledges that Kamina does not disclose isopropyl alcohol. Okay. In example rejection one, my text said that Kamina does not teach isopropyl alcohol. Here, the only difference is that the examiner is admitting it, but the rejection itself is identical. Okay. The point that I'm trying to make is that example rejection one includes less information, right? I told you the Kamina does not disclose isopropyl alcohol. Example rejection two, the examiner is telling you it does not disclose isopropyl alcohol. So example rejection one is the worst of the two rejections. Okay, that step alone blows people's minds. Like, this is actually the better rejection, even though it looks weaker. The point that I'm trying to make is that example rejection one, although it looks very difficult, is actually a weaker rejection, and therefore it's easier to overcome it. Okay. But applicants are more likely to fall into the trap of example rejection one, right? Here, the examiner's helping you. It's more effective for the examiners if you fall into the trap of example rejection one. And when you like do things like amend the claim and make these ineffective arguments, you're effectively rewarding the examiner for making a bad rejection. That's why they keep doing it, right? So we've now seen how these typical arguments are ineffective, right, in the interview context. So let's look at experimental data or amendments. Maybe these are effective, right? Well, if an effective argument is possible, then test data unnecessarily decreases the value of the patent, right? Because it can be easily attacked during enforcement, and or it increases the costs of obtaining the patent, right? Lab time, equipment, materials, like, people don't like doing tests. And if an effective argument is available, then amendments also unnecessarily decrease the value of the patent, right? Because a narrower claim might cover fewer infringing products. Today's argument that we're about to show you, well, in a little bit, basically uses the substance, EMI, of the rejection to explain why the rejection was procedurally improper in the first place. Okay. In the proper circumstances, this argument should work 100% of the time. It should always work. Always. But not all circumstances are proper, right? Like the title slide said, it's a particular rejection. Okay? So you have to have it in the right time. And not all examiners will withdraw rejections, even if the applicants are completely correct. Okay. I'd say, I don't know, 10 to 20% just maintain every rejection. It's going to vary, biological and chemical examiners are more likely to accept these kinds of arguments because they've seen them before and they correctly identify that they're persuasive. Electrical and mechanical examiners are a little bit more hesitant because they don't even know that they're doing it, right? They're not saying, I want to issue an office action with this weakness. They think this is a strength. So they're not used to seeing these arguments because the arguments themselves are rare. But even still, like my success rate's probably 90% on making this argument in front of electrical and mechanical examiners. It just usually requires a supervisor to help explain to the junior examiner why it's wrong. Okay, these are very effective arguments. But before we get to them, let's look at another example rejection. Again, everything but the yellow highlighting is the same. And here we're going to say that Kamina teaches a genus of primary alcohols included in a mixture. It would have been obvious to interpret Kamina as generally describing any alcohol in a mixture, including secondary alcohols like isopropyl alcohol. Okay. I'm deliberately making a bad argument here, right? This is supposed to be an office action. I'm sure all the chemical attorneys that are watching this are like, oh, I can really attack this. But the point that I'm making is that you're not going to see this type of rejection, okay? Examiners know that this rejection is weak. So they're not going to give it to you like this. They're going to give you example rejection one instead. Okay. This is the true meaning of like what, communa is supposed to be about, but no one's going to make it easy for you. Okay. What you're going to see is example rejection one. But let's walk through this one, right? Why is this rejection so easy? This is a really difficult concept here, and I can only really explain it visually. So over here in this graph, we've got specific claims down here and like generic claims up here. Okay. And so or specific items, not necessarily claims, specific items here and generic claim items here. And so we start with the prior art. Okay. Kamina teaches a genus of primary alcohols included in a mixture, right? So we're going to expand Kamina from a specific teaching, right? It teaches a specific one, and it's going to have generically primary alcohols. Okay. Your examiner is then modifying that disclosure and saying it would have been obvious to interpret kamina as generally describing any alcohol in a mixture, including secondary alcohols like isopropyl alcohol. To all of my mechanical and electrical siblings watching this, we will do a computer example later to explain it. But again, this is more native to chemical and biological practice. All you need to know is that primary alcohols are not secondary alcohols. Okay. And then we're going to go from this generic teaching, right? We've moved from the orange triangle to the blue triangle now. Now we're going to go down in the blue triangle. We're going to become more specific. And we're going to say that based on Kamina, it would have been obvious to include within the Shimon mixture isopropyl alcohol. We're going to come down, and this is your claimed species of isopropyl alcohol here. Okay. It looks so clear. Now let's look at example rejection one. Why does that one look hard, but is easy? Because the examiner is giving you less information. Kamina is introduced as describing alcohols in a mixture, okay, and we're trying to go up, but we don't know where. It's just some sort of cloud, I don't know, something happens. And then the examiner says, based on Kamina, it would have been obvious to include within the Shimon mixture isopropyl alcohol. Okay, we don't know what happened up here. The examiner didn't tell us. I'm telling you, what he had to do is generalize it, shift it, and then come back down. And that's going to lead to our arguments in a moment. Today's seminar is about understanding how examiners change example rejection 3 into example rejection 1, and how applicants can effectively argue against that change. The expected result of properly presenting these arguments are either the examiner provides a similar office action with additional evidence, okay, right? That can happen. It should happen. That would probably be what you would expect to happen. But because there's additional evidence, such an office action probably includes a new ground of rejection and therefore should not advance the finality of the case. Okay. You shouldn't need an RCE at this stage. I mean, I don't know, you know, anything can happen, but you shouldn't need an RCE at this stage. I don't know your particular case. I'm telling you from my experience. Or the examiner just allows the case, which is actually quite common. They make this rejection because it's their last rejection they can make, and when you overcome it, the case gets allowed. It's not rare to get an allowance after this. So what's this magic argument, Brian? There are three steps. First, the reference does not teach the claimed species. Second, the reference does not teach the asserted genus. Okay. I want to make it clear you don't have to argue step two, and there are situations in which you cannot argue step two. Okay, it is not always possible to argue step two. But the reason I'm making such a big deal about it is that this is also the biggest difference from a typical genus species obviousness analysis. Okay. Everyone watching this video probably already knows that in the United States, a species does not necessarily render, I'm sorry, a genus does not necessarily render everything within it, or every species within it obvious. This is the step that's the biggest change from that. And then we say, even if the reference does teach the genus, selecting the claimed species within that genus would not have been obvious. Okay. That's what I just said, right? The genus does not render obvious the species. Here's what we're trying to do visually. Okay. First, the reference does not teach the claimed species. Okay. You can't move from the prior art directly to the claimed species. Okay. The examiner's not trying to do that. But you have, but it's a really good foundational step to explain to the examiner why they have to follow the path that you're taking. Okay. It's an easy way to set up a win. It's an easy way to reach agreement with the examiner. I'm telling you to do it. Like, trust me, you definitely want to do it. Even though you probably don't have to, just do it. Two, the reference does not teach the asserted genus, right? So you can see the examiner's kind of coming over here, trying to move into this corner of the orange pyramid, of the orange triangle, and we're going to force him back. You can't go into this portion. It doesn't teach the blue portion, it only teaches the orange portion. And then for the third step, we say, fine, you can come into this like overlap here, right? You can be within the blue genus, but selecting the claimed species within that genus would not have been obvious. You can't come back down and be specific again. All right, let's go through it in detail. Step one, the reference does not teach the claimed species, right? So easy. This step is just the difference between example rejection one and example rejection two. Okay. You're basically just telling the examiner, like, hey, Kamina doesn't teach this. The issue on slide five is not that this argument is wrong, right? You can, right? We did the interview. The examiner says, that's not what I'm trying to say. That doesn't make it wrong. It's just that this is not enough. Okay, this is just step one. You have to go through all three steps, or should go through all three steps if you can. Okay, so it's fine that your examiner doesn't agree during the interview. Why are we doing this, right? Example rejection two was easier to understand than example rejection one, right? So presenting this argument will also make your further arguments easier to understand. Right now, the examiner is like, okay, like thinking about like where is this line of arguments going? Brian, you give us all of this great advice. What words do you actually write to make this argument, right? Show me the example. Even assuming Kamina describes alcohols in a mixture as asserted by the office action, Kamina does not teach isopropyl alcohol as one of the alcohols as recited in Claim 1. Straightforward, clear, short, to the point. If I want to get fancy, I'll add an inherency argument, right? Further, the technical goals of Kamina can be achieved by primary alcohols. Accordingly, the selection of a secondary alcohol, right, modifying from a first alcohol, a primary alcohol, like isopropyl alcohol, does not necessarily flow from the technical goals of Kamina. Therefore, it is not inherent to Kamina that the described alcohol is isopropyl alcohol. When I gave the seminar, the chemical attorneys were looking at me like I'm crazy. This is probably technically wrong. I I don't know. It's chemistry. I had to make up an example. I can do chemistry when you give it to me, usually. It's harder for me to just come up with ways that chemicals interact. I don't do enough of them to know how to do that. Step two, right? This is us steering our examiner out of the blue triangle. Reference does not teach the asserted genus. These arguments are going to differ case by case, right? Like you should expect that if I'm telling you that sometimes you can't present this. What do they depend on, Brian, right? The claim in the prior art. Specifically, you want the reference to teach a different genus than what the examiner says, right? Sometimes references are say really clear things like the mixture can be any primary alcohol. If the reference says it can be any primary alcohol, then that's clearly our genus. It's clearly a different genus than secondary alcohol. We're done. Where it gets difficult and where we start seeing it more on the electrical mechanical side is that sometimes we must propose the different genus, such as one that is more consistent with the reference. Okay. What does that look like? Right, Brian, what words do you actually write to make this argument? Well, it's going to depend on what, you know, well, so the first step is that you have to say that the reference teaches a different genus. Okay. Kamina does not disclose a broad genus of alcohols as proposed by the office action. It doesn't. It just says, rather, Kamina merely describes a genus of primary alcohols. And then we're just going to cite to the reference. Okay, you need to show the examiner where it has evidence of the primary alcohols. And then we're going to say that isopropyl alcohol is a secondary alcohol, not a primary alcohol taught by Kamina. Thus, the office action has proposed to modify the teachings of Kamina. Should the office wish to maintain the outstanding rejection, the office should provide additional evidence that such modification would have been obvious. Okay, it's so straightforward when you see how to do it. And then I said sometimes you need to propose a different genus. Okay, what does that look like? At the cited portion of Kamina, that reference describes ethanol, butanol, and glucose. Because glucose is a sugar, not an alcohol, Kamina is better understood as describing mixtures with hydroxyl groups generally rather than alcohols specifically. Okay. We're proposing the genus. The genus we think it discloses is hydroxyl groups. We're going to use words like generally to put it into the examiner's head that this is the genus. We're not going to use the word species. We're going to say the word specifically. Obviously, these words are related. And we're saying that it doesn't teach alcohols specifically. It's a totally different genus. And then again, the office has proposed to modify the teachings of Kamina should the office wish to maintain the outstanding rejection. The office should provide additional evidence that such modification would have been obvious. So, Brian, what if the reference does teach a proper genus, right? Like secondary alcohols. This is what I was telling you, okay? You can still follow today's strategy, but this time we're going to skip the step two argument, right? I can't do, if it teaches secondary alcohols, it teaches secondary alcohols. I don't have a trick for, I mean, there's other stuff, but for step two, I don't have a trick to make step two apply. That's how it works. All right, Brian, what if the reference teaches a different relevant genus? For example, reducing infectious agents. Okay, you still can do it, but we're going to skip the step two argument. Okay, it's all about identifying what is the genus that's taught by the reference. That's what step two is about. If Kamina teaches primary alcohols that reduce infectious agents, then secondary alcohols might be art-recognized equivalents. Okay, and again, in this case, we probably cannot argue step two in our example. Okay, I can't change, like, you can't do it. That's what this is about. Usually you can, almost always you can. This is the part where the examiners usually make the mistake. But sometimes you can't. Step three. All right, so here's where we're like, okay, now we're up in this overlapping portion, and we're going to try and come down to the claim species. And this is basically just your typical genus species argument. Okay. here, we discussed two genera in step two. Okay, the examiner's incorrect interpretation, right? Alcohols generally, and our correct interpretation. No, primary alcohols, not secondary alcohols. Um, so which one do we use in step three, Brian? Like, which one are we focused on? You must address the examiner's genus. If the examiner says alcohols generally, that's the one you have to talk about. If you have a different proposal, you should also address your genus. Okay, you're going to have to do both. And it doesn't matter that it's both because really what we're discussing is this other one. But, you do have to, or more accurately, yes, there will be another one because if you're in the circumstance in which you can't use step two, there won't be another one. That's the whole point of step two. Anyway, because these arguments are basically boilerplate, it is very little additional work to address both genera. Okay? It- just go ahead and do it. It's so easy. It's one extra sentence. Brian, what words do you actually write to make this argument? Even assuming Kamina describes alcohols generally, the office has not established that it would have been obvious to select within those alcohols the isopropyl alcohol recited in claim one. Okay, for this, it's going to be the boilerplate argument on slide 43. It's going to have citations to Inree, Baird, and Merck and Co. You've seen this a million times. Like, that's this argument. This is the easy one. All right. Brian, it's great that you know how to address this issue. How can Ben Rishi identify this issue, though? How can, us, Ben Rishi, know how to do this? Okay. Mazu, the Shinsakan typically acknowledges the reference does not have the claimed species. Okay. This is usually, not always, but usually it's example rejection two. Okay. That's your first clue. Nibanme, the Shinsakan describes how the reference teaches a particular genus, for example, generic alcohols, but does not cite to where the reference teaches that genus. Okay. Or sometimes they do cite and, well, it becomes more of an issue. But usually they don't cite because they don't have the evidence. If they did cite, then it looks like example rejection three, and it's very easy to figure out. So this slide is your best clue to determine when the examiner is making this type of rejection. Okay. This is it. This is your answer. If the reference taught the correct genus, the office action would definitely say where the reference teaches the correct genus, right? He would be happy to show you exactly where your claim is rejected. It's because he can't show you that this situation comes up. All right, Brian, I think I kind of get it. I want to see another example. Great. I want to give something to my electrical and software and mechanical viewers too. But first, Brian, how do you know how to make these arguments? Aren't you mainly like a software guy? And the answer is yeah, but obviousness law applies to us as well. And I have never, and I swear I mean never. I'm not saying they're not out there, but I've go to a lot of conferences and I have never met another electrical or mechanical attorney who makes these arguments. Never in my life. People I've worked with, like, no one knows how to do this. The only reason I do is because I literally sat down with a chemical attorney and I said, teach me. It took us like 3 hours. I mean, it was very difficult for me to learn. Here is a computer example. Okay. Computer networks send information in packets that can contain a header and a body, including a portion of the information. It's a packet. It looks like this. The header can include two or more fields. The fields can include information about the sending computer, the receiving computer, information about the file, right? Like the file format and so on. Okay. This is what the body of the packet looks like. This is going to be like for processing on the receiving computer or, hops along the way. I'm trying not to lose my chemical and biological viewers now. Trying to keep it easy. So my invention and my claim are going to be directed to a packet including a novel header. I'm trying to claim the header that includes a seed for a quantum encryption algorithm. Okay. My closest prior art for my examiner is going to be Yoko. Yoko discloses a computer that generates a unique cartoon image based on received information. In particular, a particular portion of the received information indicates whether the image will be an ape or a dog, right? This is an NFT, is what I'm kind of hinting at here. So here's my example rejection. Okay. Again, this is really what they look like. Reference A describes all of the features of claim one, except that the header of the packet includes a seed for a quantum encryption algorithm. Yoko is introduced as describing the identification of an encryption mechanism, right? The indication of whether it's an ape or a dog, based on received information. Therefore, based on Yoko, it would have been obvious to include within the reference A packet a seed for an encryption mechanism. I guess I should have said the closest priority is reference A. The combination of Yoko with reference A would achieve the predictable result of generating a unique cartoon image of an animal. Okay. Very standard type of rejection. So again, like, you know, part of the value of interviews is trying these arguments in front of examiners and seeing what they say live. An office action doesn't have the level of accountability that an interview does. You can't, try different arguments and see what your examiner says, right? It's just written. It's just back and forth one time. So I'm going to conduct an interview with my fictional a fictional interview with my fictional examiner and ask about the identification of an encryption mechanism, right? I'm going to say, "Hey, Mr. Examiner, what? I don't get it. Like it doesn't have an encryption mechanism in Yoko." And he's going to say, "Yeah, it does. It's how the visual attributes, the fur color, the eye color, wearing a hat of the animal are encoded." Okay, sorry. I think before I said it's whether it's a dog or an ape. It's the attributes of the dog. And he also said, oh, sorry. And he also said that the Yoko seed for the encryption mechanism is the portion of the information that indicates ape or dog. Okay. This is how it maps to the claim. So what do? We walk the examiner through it. Okay. It's obviously very different, but your examiner is going to say, oh, I've got an encryption mechanism. Who cares that yours is quantum? Right? That's what they say during the exam. And well, that's what they say during the interviews. So you walk it through. Yoko does not teach a header that includes a seed for a quantum encryption algorithm as recited in Claim 1. It doesn't. Even assuming Yoko teaches the identification of an encryption mechanism based on received information, Yoko does not teach that the encryption mechanism is quantum in nature. Okay? It's a different encryption mechanism. That's a big deal. Quantum computing is not the same. Most encryption is non-quantum encryption. Step 2. At the cited portion of Yoko, that reference describes a genus of animals encrypted in an image. Yoko does not disclose or suggest that the genus of animal encryption, for example, ape or dog, is quantum encrypted as claimed. It's not. It's just, ape or dog. Thus, the examiner's proposed modification of the Yoko genus is unsupported by evidence, right? Your examiner is trying to tell you that this is quantum encrypted. It's not. It's not. But the whole point is that he doesn't know that that's what he's trying to tell you. He's just waving his hands. He's like, oh, I'm modifying it. Well, he can't. That's your point, is that you can't just modify it. And if you just say you can't modify it, he's going to say, well, that's my job. You have to say, like, here is the modification you are trying to make. That modification, you can yeah, you can make lots of modifications. You can't make this one. Step three, in addition, even assuming Yoko describes identification of an encryption mechanism generally, the office has not established that it would have been obvious to select within those mechanisms the quantum encryption algorithm recited in claim one. Your examiner can't come down on the blue triangle to choose what you claimed. We're going to try and stick to the orange, right? You've got some sort of, yeah, we didn't invent encryption of information. That is known. We invented this packet with quantum encryption. And we're going to use our boilerplate language too. I mean, this is just the substance of it. So what's the conclusion? What did we do today? The trick is realizing that example rejection one is the same rejection as example rejection three, but is even weaker. That's a huge point. That might even be the biggest point today, is that these are really, these they seem really difficult at first, but they're actually very easy to overcome. They're really low quality rejections. We talked about the three-step argument method. Reference doesn't teach the species. It also doesn't write the claim species. It doesn't teach a relevant genus. And it's not obvious to select within the relevant species. It's not obvious to select within to select the species, the claim species within the blue triangle, the relevant genus. We talked about how to identify these rejections, right? The lack of meaningful citations in a genus species context. You really need to pay attention to what your examiner's citing. That's your clue. And then we gave an example for the computers. Um, Again, example rejection one is the same rejection as example rejection three, but is even weaker. We talked about step one, can't go directly there. Step two, like, don't try and come over here, stay in what you're teaching. And then step three of like, don't come down. Like, maybe you've got the genus, but that you still can't get to my species. We can recognize the rejection by the lack of meaningful citations. And again, the rejection occurs in predictable arts like mechanical or computer technologies as well. Like, I can't stress that. And like, no one knows what to do with them on the electrical side because no one makes these arguments because none of us are trained this way. All right, Brian, you said examiners sometimes make example rejection too by acknowledging the reference does not disclose the claimed species. So even in this case, do we have to argue step one? Yeah, it's the starting point for your arguments. Okay. Remember, your examiners begin re-examination of the case by reading your response, not their office action, right? They send out the office action. 3 months later, your response comes in. They don't even look at it for like 2.5 months. And then they pick it up and they don't say, what did I say? They begin with, what did the applicant do? Right? Did they amend the claim? Because they don't know, right? They don't know till they look at it. Maybe you canceled every claim and replaced them with a whole new set. Maybe you didn't amend it all. Like, it's always going to begin with what you did, not with what they did. And when they read your arguments, they haven't looked at their office action for like 6 months, okay? 5.5 months. So by making this argument, you are focusing the examiner on the key issues in the rejection. The examiner isn't going to, it doesn't matter whether the rejection says, you know, um, Kamina does not disclose this type of alcohol, right? You have to begin somewhere, and that's a good beginning spot. The examiner's not going to look back at his office action first. You begin by saying, Kamina does not disclose this type of alcohol. I promised to show you my boilerplate language. This is basically copied from the MPEP. It's edited a little, I think. It's boilerplate. You just copy and paste it in. You should include it in the relevant arguments here. But this is, it's boilerplate. It's not going to change. I don't even like boilerplate. I use it here. That concludes today's seminar. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you very much.